Almost 200 years after being outlawed, the practice of sati still looms large over every academic discourse about Hindu philosophy and customs. It remains a potent symbol of deep-rooted patriarchy and cultural misogyny of pre-modern India. Time and again, the banning of sati has been invoked to argue that British colonialism helped bring a regressive Indian society out of the Dark Ages. Even for contemporary Indians who are proud of their heritage and culture, Sati Pratha poses a strange predicament. How did a civilization so advanced in science and philosophy that produced great thinkers through the ages, such as Mahavira, Gautam Buddha, Kabir Das, Adi Shankara, and many more, oddly remained comfortable with a practice so barbarous? With so many glorious periods under numerous Indian dynasties from Guptas to Vijayanagara, Mughals to Marathas, why did India need a foreign mercantilist power to ultimately put an end to this cruel and inhuman custom? It is important to address these questions as they play a key role in how we Indians see ourselves as a people. Were our ancestors really as backward and superstitious as we are told? And did Indians really need the enlightened Victorians to free her from its social evils? To address this question and many other related questions, we have with us Dr. Meenakshi Jain, a highly esteemed scholar, renowned historian, and author of many deeply researched books. For her notable contributions to education and literature, in 2020, she was conferred with Padma Shri, India's fourth highest civilian award. Dr. Jain has extensively researched the subject of sati and the colonial discourse that preceded its eventual abolishment in 1829. Her research findings form the basis of her acclaimed book, Sati, Evangelicals, Baptist Missionaries, and the Changing Colonial Discourse. Dr. Jain, I'm really honored to be in your presence. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Ma'am, sati is a vast subject, and we've only come to know about it when it's presented to us as a social evil that the British helped India get rid of. But most Indians tend to know very little about where did it start, what were the origins, does it find its origins in cultural practices and customs, or it's in the religion, in the scripture? So if you could shed some light to get started.
Yes, but before I talk about the scriptures, since you mentioned the British colonial rule, I want to say that before the abolition of sati by Lord William Bentinck, many Englishmen had come to India as traders of the East India Company, and they had written very, very impressive tracts on India. It's important to remember that these early Englishmen were traders of the East India Company, yet they found India to be such a bewitching civilization that they wrote texts on India. The first text that was written by an Englishman who was an official of the East India Company was John Gross, and he wrote a text in 1757. After that, we have a series of accompaniment traders, Scrafton, Holwell, Alexander Doe, so many. And it is very important to note this point that these company men, they don't mention sati at all. And they take pains to understand this religion, the spiritual heritage, the civilization, and they write in such glorious terms about India. And Holwell, he even served as temporary governor of Bengal after Clive. And he says that if such a thing can be said about a people, they are an ornament to civilization. So these are the kind of praises and critical acclaim of Indian culture and civilization by employees of that same East India Company, which a few decades later, under William Bentinck, abolishes sati. Before I come to your question, I want to make 2-3 other points. Before William Bentinck came to India as Governor General, he had already decided to abolish sati before coming to India. And how do we know this? Because, the collected works of William Bentinck have been published in 2 volumes, and they contain 2 letters of his to a colleague in which he says that I have already decided that when I assume office as Governor General, I will abolish sati. So, this whole controversy that was created by the British has to be understood in the backdrop of the rampant missionary propaganda against sati. We have to understand the missionary propaganda in the light of the evangelical movement that started in Britain. Why did the evangelical movement start? It was a reaction to the French Revolution. Englishmen felt that the cause of the French Revolution was the irreligion propagated by Voltaire. And they wanted to stop such a movement in their own country and in countries that they controlled outside in the rest of the world. So we can discuss this later. What I'm trying to say is that the propaganda against sati was the handiwork of missionaries, Baptist missionaries. It was an offshoot of the evangelical movement, and we will discuss the role that the missionaries played in false propaganda on sati. Now, I will come to your question about the scriptural evidence of sati. This whole debate about whether the scriptures sanctioned sati was inadvertently started in 1795 by a young company man, H.T. Colebrook. Colebrook later became a very, very important student of Indian history. He wrote a lot on India. But his first work was on the duties of a faithful Hindu widow. That was published in 1795. In that article, he quoted the Rig Vedic funeral hymn. And he quoted that hymn and he translated the word agre. Agre means first, to agne, which means fire. So, as soon as this article was published, Sir William Jones, we've all heard of Sir William Jones. William Jones at once said this is a wrong interpretation. And H.H. Wilson, who was again a very profound Sanskrit scholar and translated the Vishnu Puran from Sanskrit into English and so much other work. He said, you must translate this verse according to the rules that have been laid down by Sayan, the medieval Sanskrit scholar. And he again said it is wrong. Subsequently, several decades later, the great P.V. Kane. P.V. Kane has written a 6-volume history of the Dharma Shastras, which is a very compulsory reading for anyone who wants to study Indian religious texts. And P.V. Kane says that this misinterpretation of the word agre to agne was because of a careless error by the scribe who was copying this verse from another verse. The point to note is that no authority, European or Indian, ever claimed that this verse had been authentically translated by H.T. Colebrook. But the point is that, and I don't blame, because everyone is not a scholar and everyone doesn't want to be a scholar. But that impression that it was enjoying religious sanction, somehow it caught the fancy of people who were trying to denigrate Indian civilization. Now, after Rigved, this funeral hymn, there is no reference to the rite of widow immolation. The Brahmanas, the Greh Sutras don't mention widow immolation at all. Manu, we revile Manu as, very anti-women, but he says that women, girls, are like the lamp in the house they are born. They're like a lamp, they light the house. And they are the responsibility of the father when they're young, the husband when they're married, and the son when the husband is no longer there. So why does Manu say that the women are the responsibility of the son after the husband is not there? Obviously, he does not recommend and does not discuss sati at all. Yajna Valk, he says wives are the greatest gifts of God, and we must cherish them and love them. And he says that when a woman becomes a widow, a chaste life is recommended for her. So this refrain is there in all the texts until we come to the early medieval period. And one more thing, before I come to the early medieval period, the authoritative commentary on Manusmriti, I've forgotten who's written that thing, I'll just tell you, it'll come. He also says that committing sati is like black magic. So this is the evidence. But around the 7th, 8th century, we have one person who recommends widow immolation. But that resistance to that practice continues in several other works that are composed in that period.
So there is, just to clarify a few things. So we don't have much evidence of religion sanctioning it or prescribing it. At least there is no like different spiritual leaders who are recommending it in their text, at least until the 17th century.
Yes.
It seems that there are historical mentions of it,
yes,
albeit sparse. And so it may have persisted as a social practice, which eventually started finding some advocates among religious scholars by the 16th century. Do you think that could be a possibility?
1 minute. I just want to mention that name, Medhatithi.
Okay. Yeah.
Medhatithi was the authoritative commentator on Manusmriti, and he also. Now you talked about the practice of sati. Now, when we discuss sati, it is always important to keep the statistics in mind. Obviously, there were instances of sati. We cannot deny that. The first point that I have made, that it did not enjoy religious sanction till a very long time. Until the 18th century.
Okay, 18th century.
Till the 18th century, we have this in the 18th century, Stri Dharm Padhati. It is a text written by a Brahmin in Tanjore. And he is, dealing with the encroachments of the Christian missionaries and Islamic attacks. And he says that, in this hostile environment, maybe sati is a way out. But he also says that a chaste life is always preferable for a widow. So from the 7th, 8th century, some authors begin to recommend it, but the people who oppose it is always there. There is never uniformity that among the authors that there should be widow immolation. Now you talked about the actual instances of sati. And I said that when we discuss sati, we have to keep the actual instances that we know actually happened. Because in this debate on sati, the figures become exponential at a particular period in our history. Why does it become? I'll discuss that. But the first definite instance of sati happens when Alexander, who invaded India, is going back home. He had an Indian contingent with him. And when he was near Afghanistan, the head of that Indian contingent dies. And the soldiers, the Greek soldiers in the army are, amazed and horrified when that Indian captain's two widows come and they argue among themselves who should immolate with him. So this is an instance that actually happened. Okay, so that is around the 3rd century BC, 3rd, 4th century BC. We cannot doubt the authenticity of this report.
It's very old.
It's very old and there's no reason to fabricate it.
And when you talk about like how prevalent it is in pre-modern India, pre-colonial India, do we have, you said there's not that much in terms of statistics. We don't see many mentions of it. All we have are like some sati stones and all. But is it prevalent all over? Yes, sorry.
There is inscriptional evidence which I want to come to. Because
but was it prevalent all over the country, like, or was it like limited to a certain region or certain caste group or a certain social community, or was it pan-India?
Now let me answer. The first epigraphic evidence that we have of sati is from Madhya Pradesh. It is the 6th century, and that inscription is still standing, the Iran Inscription. That inscription records that a general of Bhanugupt, King Bhanugupt, had died and his widow immolated. So that is also evidence. This is in Madhya Pradesh. I'm talking about the geographical spread. I'm taking all those questions. But
Sure.
before this 6th century inscription, we have the earliest inscription of the 5th century, actually from Nepal. And that inscription says that this queen, she tells her son, please relieve me of my duties. I do not wish to continue as officiating regent or whatever it is. So relieve me of my duties. You know, it seems to imply that she's going to follow her husband, but actually she does not immolate herself. So the first instance that is, we have an inscription is the Iran inscription. Okay, from Madhya Pradesh, which is still standing. So that inscription talks about the widow of a general in the Gupta army. So you can deduct or deduce from that what would be the caste of that person. The second inscription that we have is from the Chola period. And it is an inscription by Shudra woman. Dekabi is her name. Her husband dies fighting the Gangas, and she decides to immolate herself. That inscription has survived. On the one side of the inscription, there are scenes of how the parents are persuading her, illustrations. And at the back is the inscription. And the parents are pleading with her, don't do it, don't immolate. And she is determined to immolate. So this is an inscription recording a case of immolation by a Shudra woman whose name is given and whose parents try to dissuade her. And when they fail, this inscription is erected by her parents. Okay. Now we come to Madhya Pradesh again, where we have the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta.
Yeah, very famous.
Very famous. And he records that he saw 3 women getting ready to immolate themselves because their husbands had died fighting the Sumras in Sindh. He says so he mentions where they had husbands had died. He mentions Sindh, and he mentions that I saw them here, and he describes their demeanor and their courage, etc. So these are a few instances. Kalhan in the Raj Tarangini mentions 1 or 2 instances. And it is interesting that we are only talking about widows immolating with the death of the husband. There are cases like Kalhan mentions Suryamati. When she dies, a senior officer of her husband offers his head so that he can follow the queen. And there is a Chalukya king, his wife dies, and a senior person of that entourage, male member, emulates with her. So I'm not saying that that was a common practice, but we also have certain instances of males emulating with the woman. Now, when we talk about, then I want to give you examples of Vijayanagar. You know the Vijayanagar king, Krishnadevaraya?
Yeah, of course.
So his wives did not emulate. But to go back.
So just to summarize, the practice is clearly not universal.
No.
But we can find sparse examples from all over the country.
The first inscription from Rajasthan is dated to 842 Common Era. There is no inscription on Sati before 842 for Rajasthan.
So the common the common perception that this was like a Rajput thing and kind of limited to Rajasthan and a medieval practice, all of these are not true.
No.
There are instances where it started in antiquity.
Yeah.
There seems to be examples all over India, and it's not particularly linked, because you mentioned Shudra woman also doing, so it's not particularly linked to a Rajput caste or anything.
But at a particular point in history, Sati and Johar become identified with the Rajput communities. And there is a link between Sati and Johar in the case of Rajasthan, because the Sati, the woman who emulates, says she is complementing, C-O-M-P-L-E, complementing her husband's heroic death on the battlefield, which is not, perhaps not true for other parts of the subcontinent, but in Rajasthan, it becomes closely associated with the warrior class.
But it's still different, right? She doesn't join him on the pyre or anything.
No.
Of this. Ritualistically, it's different.
Yeah. And 2 recorded instances of Johar, which are recorded in the medieval literature. One is in Jaisalmer, when Alauddin Khalji attacks. So there is mass Johar. And the other is when Akbar attacks Chittor. So these are 2 important cases of mass
suicide
emulation. Can we go back a little bit to
Yes, of course.
So, I'm sure your viewers will not get distracted, but it's important, we should have discussed this earlier perhaps, that, in the Ramayana, none of the wives of King Dashrath emulates, and none of the wives of Ravan emulate. But in the Mahabharata, we have certain instances like Madri, the younger wife of King Pandu. When Pandu dies, she decides to immolate herself. And the Mahabharata clearly states that the assembled people and the sages, they told her, please don't do it. You're not looking after, you're not caring for your young children. But she insists. Madri insists, but Kunti does not immolate herself. Isn't it?
And when does Madri's self-immolation, is it mentioned as Sati in Mahabharata? Do they use that term?
No. See, Sati comes from the Sanskrit word Sat, goodness, chaste, virtuous. So there were many people in our tradition who acquired the designation of Sati without immolating themselves, like Sati Savitri. Even today we say, "Arey, thinks she's great, Savitri." So that was the epitome of virtue and chaste conduct. So Sati Savitri, Sati Sita, Sati Anusuya. These are women who got the designation of Sati by their chaste life and they did not immolate themselves before or after their husbands.
Right. So this was one of the paths to get to that glorified, I guess, role for a woman. And one more thing, maybe it helps to go back a little bit on. So actually, let's come to the colonial and missionary part later. Let's first go through what happened before the colonizers came. Do we have any of India's great philosophers, be it Buddha, Kabir Das, Adi Shankara, Guru Nanak, talk about this? Like, if I would imagine these people are talking about caste problems, they're talking about other kinds of social issues. So if this was a social issue in their era, their period, they would have talked about it.
According to me, none of them talked about it.
Right. So
there is no reference to Sati in any Buddhist texts, and the Jains in any case abhorred all forms of violence. So there is no question, but there is no reference to Sati by any of these people.
So perhaps it's kind of like it might be a rare enough thing not to be important enough for them to spend their works on.
I want to add one thing here. May I?
Yeah, of course.
In the medieval period, the Islamic empire had become a world empire, and it controlled all the trade routes to India by land and by sea. So Europe's link with India got broken. In the ancient period, we know that India had a flourishing relationship with Rome, etc., etc. But with the establishment of the Islamic world empire that controlled all the land and sea routes, the link to India got broken. So at this time, when the link between Europe and India was broken or controlled by the Arabs, then, all fanciful accounts of India began to circulate in Europe. There was nobody to verify them. And this was the time when in Europe, they began to say that, in India, there is a Christian king. His name is Prester John. And if the Crusades march from here and they're able to establish contact with the Prester John, then he will march this and will be able to meet the threat. So this was all imaginative. But what happened was that when Vasco da Gama discovered a new route to India, that is when Europe's links with India again revived. And in the 15th and 16th century, we have this situation where many people are coming to India out of curiosity. And they all write accounts of India because they say they will get such a big market back home. And it is surprising that all of them, because they're writing about the exotic India or the exotic East, they all write about Sati. And scholars who have examined all these writings of European travelers to India in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, they were astonished to discover that they're copying from each other. So, so they say there is not even a comma change. So the same paragraph they will reproduce. So all the writers, because they're looking for a market back home, and these accounts, they never tell us which part of India they're. So it's neutral, in India there is Sati, this thing. They have not seen. If you've seen a Sati, you will say, I saw it in Bombay, or I saw it in Tanjore, or I saw it in Bengal or something. So they just copy that thing and reproduce. This is not me saying this, a modern scholar who has worked on Sati, examined these medieval European accounts and said they're just copying from each other, plagiarism in its original form.
Well, I would imagine, like, if you make the trip halfway around the world to visit an exotic land, you do not want to come back and say, I didn't see anything exotic. So you will make up those things.
Yeah.
It's kind of like thinking like when, even maybe it's not a good example, but when we go to like wildlife sanctuary, a lot of people come back and say, yeah, I think I saw the lion, I saw the tiger.
Yes. It's exactly like that. And this is not something that I have discovered. This is something that a reputed Western scholar has analyzed these accounts and come to this conclusion.
Right. So all of these accounts further added to the mystique and mystery around India, and there is these exotic practices, and the stereotypes get becoming more and more entrenched in the Western mind.
I want to add one example. There was a Frenchman, Duperon. He came to India in search of texts, etc. He was he wrote a lot on India, intelligent person. And he went back home. He also wrote an account of his travels in India. And sure enough, in the account of the travels in India, he had to include Sati. So he writes that, I saw this Sati, etc. Nobody doubted his account. But then afterwards, he wrote, and I quoted this in my book on Sati, he says, I did not see Sati. In this instance, I failed to tell the truth.
Okay, at least he confesses.
Yeah.
And when these people talk about Sati, I mean, do they have a concept of women's rights at the time? Like, are they saying that this was horrible, a woman, to see a woman commit suicide, or they're just glorifying it like, wow, what courageous women, they're walking into fire? Like, what was their perception at the time?
There is the famous case of the founder of Calcutta, Job Charnock. He's supposed to have rescued a woman who was going to immolate herself and married her. But there are many accounts which say that women resented this interference with what they felt that they wanted to do. So this thing of white men rescuing brown women from brown men, as has been famously said by a scholar, it was not something that the Indians were looking for. The Indians were not looking for white men to save them. And there were only one or two instances. I've given you the example of Job Charnock, but I think it was Alexander Hamilton who said that, if you try to interfere with this, then they resent you trying to deprive them of their, rightful duty or whatever they perceive it to be. So it is not something that the Hindu women were waiting to be rescued from because first of all, it was not rampant, it was not common, it was very rare. And so the question of, being required to be saved by somebody was not at all called for.
Yeah, and I think it's very common for colonial governments to use social evils in any society as a pretext for their presence there and their oppression over those people. We saw that all over South America, where they again and again talk about child sacrifice or human sacrifice as a reason that they are there to save those people from themselves, from their barbarity.
But when they were getting so outraged about what was happening in India, did they not notice that women were being burnt as witches in Europe?
Correct.
How many missionaries protested at the treatment of women in their own countries? Women were...
and that went on till mid-18th century, mid-18th century,
yes. So, but I'm not aware of any missionaries taking up the cause of women in their countries.
Actually, I do want to get to the question of missionaries' motivations. But before that, just very quickly, before the British outlawed Sati in Bengal, did any Indian regime at any point try to enact a law to regulate it or discourage it?
Very, very important question. I'm very glad that you asked this. There is no question of one government outlawing, because the whole of India was not gripped with this, and there was no one ruler over but I can give you the examples of many kings who protested against it and stopped it in their own region. And the most important example, the foremost example that I would like to give is of King Harsh. King Harsh was ruling over Thaneshwar, and his father was still king, but was seriously ill. And his mother said, I'm going to immolate. I'm going to immolate before the death of her husband. So Harsha said, you're not going to do this. She said, no, I have lived like a lioness. I cannot live without my mate as a, I don't want that kind of life. Harsha tries to stop her, but she immolates herself before the death of her husband, who was then the king. Harsha fails in the case of his mother, but he succeeds in preventing his sister from immolating. Rajshri was his sister. Her husband died. Harsha came to know that she's going to immolate. He rushed there, stopped her, brought her back, and she plays an important life in the administrative work of in his kingdom. That is King Harsh. If I can go to Shivaji, Shivaji's mother wanted to immolate herself when her husband died, and Shivaji rebuked her and she stopped. But when Shivaji died, one of his wives immolated, and when his son died, one of his wives immolated, and one wife in the case of Madhavrao Peshwa. But the Marathas were not at all comfortable with this practice. They tried to stop it, and we know Ahilyabai Holkar. Ahilyabai Holkar was the Rani of her kingdom. She was a Maratha. She is remembered today for building the Kashi Vishwanath temple and the Somnath temple. She did not immolate. Her husband died. She ruled in his absence now as the ruler after her husband died. And when her daughter died, when her daughter's husband died, she tried to persuade the daughter not to immolate, but she could not persuade the daughter, and the daughter immolated. There are so many other cases. I told you about Krishna Deva Rai. His queens survived after him.
Right. So these people don't seem to be in favor of doing it. But are there any evidence of any edicts being passed by any of the Indian regimes to stop ordinary people from doing that?
Ordinary people were very rare in any case. So where was the question of?
Right.
No, and I just want to say that, it has become common practice that we credit Lord William Bentinck for this abolition of sati. So in Bengal itself, I want to say that Mrityunjay Vidya Alankar, he was the chief Pandit of the British court. He had also served in Fort William College. And he told the company officials, sati enjoys no religious sanction. If you want to act on this, it will cause no resentment among the people. So this contribution of Mrityunjay Vidya Alankar, how many of us remember? We are only remembering Lord William Bentinck. But there were so many people. The third Sikh Guru, then the Maratha kingdoms of Tanjore, Savantwadi, they had stopped it. They had said no. But there's no question of passing a universal law, because it was not a universal custom in the whole of any kingdom.
Makes sense. And when you mentioned the reaction, so when they did abolish sati, what was the reaction in Bengal? But
first we need to discuss Bengal before we come to the reaction.
Okay, perfect. No? So you had mentioned earlier that
one thing more, I'm sorry to disturb you again and again, but I do want to make one point. That, we are in all the debate on sati, we focus on Bengal and the contribution of the British in ridding us of this supposedly rampant custom. In that same British period, how many British missionaries or administrators talked about sati in Rajasthan? Look at the contrast between the British treatment of sati in Bengal and the same British treatment of sati in Rajasthan. In Rajasthan, James Todd, he glorified sati as a tribute to the valor of a soldier by his brave wife. So, there sati is elevated by British colonial administrators, the best example being James Todd. And you mentioned about Rajput kingdoms also. There also the practice was declining. The Raja of Bundi, told James Todd that when I die, make sure that no wife of mine immolates herself. James Todd has recorded this in his 6-volume Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. But I am saying, look at the way that same custom in that same period, in Bengal, it is supposed to be rampant. And in Rajasthan, where it had actually become
Rare.
a practice,
Okay.
they employ double standards, you know.
And there is a view that perhaps it had become rampant in Bengal under the British because of the changes to property rights and all, like certain widows who had gotten land grants, those lands were being forfeited by the British as they do not recognize those previous land grants anymore. And these women, this was a kind of a way of like a social retaliation. Is there any merit in that
Not
argument?
at all. I'll talk about this Daya Bhag system. But before that, I just want to say, I'm talking about Bengal now.
Mm-hmm.
The East India Company was very clear that it had come to Bengal to make money. It had not come on a civilizing mission. And so it was very clear that it will not allow any missionary activity in the territory under its control. So if any missionary came to territory under British control, he was sent back on the next ship. So, you know, but the missionaries were very, very keen to come to Bengal, and they went on asking Parliament. And Parliament agreed with the East India Company that they're on a money-making mission and not on a civilizing mission. So the missionaries, the Baptist missionaries, were the ones who were operative in Bengal. They quietly came, 3 of them, and the moment they landed in Calcutta, they quickly went to Shirampur because that was a Danish colony which permitted missionaries to operate there. Now, the missionaries, they had to convince Parliament, the British Parliament, that their presence was required in India and they must be given the right to conversion. So how could they convince Parliament? They had to present a picture of Hindu society as ridden with evils. And the most important evil that struck them was Sati. So can you imagine William Carey and the Srirampur missionaries, they commissioned a private survey. A private survey, they employed 10 people and they said, report all cases of Sati in and around Calcutta. And can you imagine, we are supposed to believe that Bengal was the harbinger of modern India. Modern India is supposed to have begun from Bengal, the Bengal Renaissance. It's supposed to have shown India the way. And that Bengal, which was supposed to be having pioneer, you know, educators, that was steeped in the custom of Sati. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, no, it's hard to believe.
So they commissioned a private survey. For 10 years, you're supposed to collect the evidence. And you will be surprised to know that the results of that survey were presented differently by different missionaries. So the figures were exaggerated. The accounts of the missionaries who commissioned that survey and other missionaries do not match. So that was the whole hoax, you know. So this is something that...
but then just to continue the story, they presented these results to the British Parliament, I imagine, and,
yes,
and they were sanctioned.
But the British Parliament, there were many India hands. And they said that do not give them the right to convert. In fact, people who came to British Parliament to depose against the missionaries included Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings was the first Governor General of India. And he said that it is sad that the Indian people have been presented in such bad light. And he said that this is a wrong thing that you have done. So many people in British Parliament spoke against missionary activities. They said, you're like sharks that have gone there. And in fact, there was a pamphlet war in England between the missionaries and those who opposed the missionaries. So, this was a hotly debated topic. But finally, in 1813, I have a chapter in my book on how they orchestrated petitions to Parliament, the missionaries. It is, like a modern
Lobbying.
Yeah, it is really surprising how they, Wilberforce, he appealed to people, send petitions to Parliament. So hundreds and hundreds of petitions were sent to Parliament. They produced articles, they produced pamphlets, they addressed public rallies, public meetings. So they whipped up this whole sentiment. And then finally in 1813, the missionaries were given right to propagate in India. But I must continue this. In 1821, Parliament discussed, some people put up the question of sati, and Parliament did not even discuss it, the British Parliament, because they realize it is all a concoction and there is a motive behind it.
So public relations campaigns were as effective they were.
And the last thing, yes, absolutely. And you asked me what was the reaction? The reaction was that not a dog barked.
So when it was abolished in 1829, there was no outrage in the society, there was no backlash.
Nothing, because people were not practicing it in any case.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Now today, if you say that, now we are passing a law that sati is banned, who's going to protest? Since we are not practicing it, why will we protest?
But I think it's good PR back home where you say, oh, we are in India, we are oppressing people, but see, we are doing good things. We have abolished their horrible practice of sati. And it's interesting because even till today, when we see debates about the empire go on in Britain, where bizarrely they're still discussing whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to colonize people, they again and again come back to sati, that we ended sati. So that is why our presence in India had some good sides to it.
And the British historian, Christopher Bailey, he wrote a very, very important article. He said, how much debate was spent on this non-issue. How come the fact that millions were dying of starvation and famine in India did not excite any debate and comment? After all, in this period, millions were dying because of famine created by British-induced policies. But did the missionaries agitate about that? About the policies of the British government?
But I think, well, from a PR standpoint, right, just evoking the image of a woman, especially a young bride, putting herself in flames, that creates such a spectacle that you can garner a lot more interest than poor peasants starving and dying.
Yes, absolutely.
So that makes perfect sense. But it seems like ultimately, even after the missionaries were successful, they didn't really make much headway in terms of converting people, right? We don't see evidence for that.
Actually, there was another group of missionaries in the South. They were the French Jesuit missionaries. And the most prominent among them, for our purposes, is Abbé du Bois. He wrote a series of lectures on the state of Christianity in India. They have been republished and are available on the net in case any of your viewers want to see them. And he says that, I have lived in India, South India, for close to 3 decades. And he says that the conversions is next to impossible. Just forget about conversions is next to impossible. And he says that these Baptist missionaries of Bengal, how much they have struggled to paint the Hindus in the blackest terms. And he says that in the whole country where you travel, you'll find so many, shaven widows, because the widows shave their heads. So he says the country abounds with shaven head women. And he really takes on the Baptist missionaries and he says, I have not been able to convert. Hardly 2 people. It's a waste of time. those letters of his really deserve to be read, because they give us such a totally different, and he says, how important the family is, the central institution in Hindu society, and how the brothers and fathers, how they care for the girl child, and he says that the family is such a strong unit. He writes a very, very beautiful account of society, which is diametrically opposite to what William Ward was writing when he was sitting in Bengal. In that same period, William Ward wrote a 4-volume study of Hindu society, customs and whatever, and Abu Dubois wrote sitting in the South. And it's amazing that for the same period, for the same country, you can have such contrasting views.
Yeah, I mean, our own biases inform what we see. Like the facts could be same. We see the same thing, but our preconceived minds, our biases allow us to interpret the same thing in very different ways.
Yes.
So the debate that took place in Bengal and in the British Parliament, it seems like it was about what does the scripture say, what the Hindu scriptures, what Hindus should do, whether they're doing it or not doing it. Was it ever about women's rights?
No, the thing is, it was not about scriptures or not. They were not interested in that. They were just saying that it's a common practice. The debate about scriptures was only that H.T. Colebrook article, for which there was a response by William Jones, H.H. Wilson, and later by P.V. Kane. So they were not interested in the scriptures and all. They were interested in presenting the horrors that they saw before them. So they were not, William Carey was not interested in what the scriptures are saying. He said so many women, thousands of women are immolating every year in Hindustan. So their thing was to present it as a horrific situation, and they asked women in Britain to contribute to the missionary effort. They said, your sisters in India, will you not help them? Contribute to the cause. And 15 to 20% of the contributions to the missionary societies were by women in England.
Okay, so they were able to rally some early feminists in the 1800s. I want to bring a contrarian viewpoint now. Even if it's pretty clear that it was never prevalent, it was never rampant the way it was projected. But the few incidents that took place, they have been glorified by the contemporaries of those days through the Sati inscriptions and stones that have become places of worship, and just the collective memory of those incidents. Like people treat the widows who did this act in a very glorified manner. But what does that say about us as a society, like our thought process? Does it not say that we think a woman extracts her essence and importance only by the virtue of her husband, and when he's dead, she becomes instantly worthless? So either she lives a life of being worthless where she has no pleasure, no agency, nothing, or she just ends her life right away because without the husband, she is of no value. Is that not the right way to interpret
it? Not at all. This is not at all the correct picture. First of all the texts that I have quoted to you say that she is the responsibility of the son. And in Bengal, you were talking about the inheritance laws. The Daya Bhag law, the Daya Bhag system that was operative in Bengal, says that on the death of the father, the property has to be divided among the sons in the presence of the mother, and the mother will get an equal share to the sons. So this is about, the inheritance rights. And in Bengal, there was a chief justice whose statement I have mentioned in my book. He says that in my court, I have so many cases where property concerning women is under dispute. So there were women who were widows, who were inheriting property, and maybe the husband's brother or somebody was challenging, and there were cases in court. Now, the thing is that when you talk about Sati memorials, you talked about Sati memorials. Sati, or the immolation, was not something that anyone could do. It was of rare occurrence. And because if it was of rare occurrence, it evoked deep reverence in society to those who showed that extraordinary courage to take that step. And that is why Sati stones were erected in memory of those women. Sati stones never valorized one particular instance, one particular case. They were called Sati stones. Most of them emphasized the act rather than the person. Apart from that Kabir and that Iran stone inscription, most of the Sati stones that we have found, they do not mention the name of the woman. So they are not, invoking the memory of one particular woman. They're invoking the memory of an ideal, that ideal of a virtuous, chaste woman. Very few women felt compelled to go on that path. But the few that did aroused the reverence of society. If you look at the number of kings, first of all, it was not a common practice except for that Kabir and Petra della Vella. He was an Italian nobleman who came to India. He recorded the case of a drummer's wife emulating. So he described that very vividly in his account of the travels of India. She was from Ikeri and she was the wife of a drummer. So he participates in the procession that is taking, but he does not witness the actual immolation. So, to make Daulat Rao Sindhya, his widow, she erected that pavilion at Gyanvapi. That was erected by her. I mentioned Ahilyabai Holkar. There is in Gujarat the case of Naiki Devi. She was the queen regent. Her son was an infant. She did not immolate herself. And in fact, there is an account written at that time which says that when Muhammad Ghori attacked her kingdom, she took her infant son with her on horseback and defeated the invader. So there are so many cases, instances where women who have become widows lead a very active public life. And there are cases where women are getting a share of the husband's property. When we talk about I'm surprised that, even today, in most discussions, we still have that colonial hangover, because that has got so embedded in our thinking in every school textbook. Social reforms of Lord William Bentinck, abolition of sati. But which ruler was advocating sati? Which ruler was saying, in my kingdom, you have to practice sati? It was not the case at all. That doesn't mean that cases of sati did not happen. But when you do a statistical study, there are very few and far between. And as I mentioned, Christopher Bailey saying that millions were dying of famines induced by the British, they aroused no comment or concern of the missionaries and others.
So they create this monster, a fictional monster that they'd assailed and destroyed, and did this huge great thing for India as benign rulers, new benign rulers of India who are taking India into the enlightened age. And that's a narrative that has prevailed for a very long time.
One thing I want to say about William Bentinck. William Bentinck was also a member of the Evangelical Society.
Oh God. So that already puts his
yes.
into all his actions and motivations into question. I want to move now to sort of the contemporary discourse. When people talk about Sati now. Do you think this colonial exaggeration of prevalence of Sati practice in India and the way it's been projected as a violent act where others force a woman to do this, do you think it still informs views about Hinduism and Indian culture are understood around the world?
Before independence, there was only one full-length book on Sati, that was by Edward Thompson. When before independence, the practice is supposed to have been so rampant. Apart from missionaries like William Ward, William Carey, who had a vested interest, there was no full-length book on Sati except by Edward Thompson in 1928. After independence, according to government statistics, around 40 cases of Sati have taken place in 75 years after independence. None of those cases has been reported from Bengal, which is supposed to have been the epicenter of widow immolation. 2/3 of the 40 cases have been reported from Rajasthan, which still retains that tradition of reverence towards Sati. But though 40 cases have been recorded in post-independence India, every second feminist is writing a book on Sati. So the actual instances of Sati is very disproportionate to the literature that is being produced on Sati.
And why do you think that is the case?
Because as I said, there is a perception of viewing Hindu society in terms of caste, in terms of patriarchy, and Western notions, which are either of the colonial period or subsequently, but it is not trying to look at India and the Indian story through Indian eyes and through Indian sources. How is it so difficult to collect all the epigraphic evidence? For 2000 years of our history, it's not that difficult. But it's something that is not being done because it shows the limited nature of that. And how many people, in these textbooks, we talk about William Bentinck abolishing Sati, but how is it that the Indian voices who were advising the British well before Lord Bentinck, they are not heard? We don't hear of them. And more important, British governors of other presidencies, like the Bombay presidency and the Madras presidency, they were saying that there is no such thing in our areas. There's hardly one case in a decade. They were informing the parliament. And their statements have been reproduced in my book. That it's something that is, we cannot understand this debate. The ruler of Tanjore had prohibited it. The Indian rulers who prohibited it in their kingdoms, they're not mentioned. And the voice,
governors of Bengal,
yes, of Bombay and Madras, yes.
They said there's no cases in there.
Yes, they said it's few and far between. But it's not the way you're presenting it at all.
And so I think that is already quite well established now, right? Like the way colonial narrative has been, and even till today, like if you look at the movies and produced in the Western world about the colonial period, British TV dramas or movies or even books, Indian characters don't seem to have any voices or any complex views. They're single-dimensional people who just go about their business, and all the debates, the good guys and the bad guys are always the British themselves. They're the ones leading, they're the ones making the discoveries, making historical discoveries, telling Indians about themselves.
And how many of these voices that I've mentioned to you do you find in these debates?
Yeah, none. No. Actually, that's the point. Indians are very unidimensional characters. There's no complexity. There are no different opinions among Indians. And I think the body of literature that has been produced with this colonial mindset has been borrowed by textbooks from China to America. And when they talk about, and when they teach about Indian civilization, ancient India, medieval India as well, this is the narrative that informs them. And in our ordinary experiences, when we tell people about Hinduism or we talk about that, the first question comes to us, whether it's a French person or a Taiwanese person, is, oh, I hear there is caste system in India and there is sati. Not denying it does not, of course it existed, but a lot more important things, a lot more bigger things existed.
But how minute it was is something that has to be stressed. And what
Exactly.
about but Sati, that German scholar that I told you about, global history of widow immolation. So he has found stray instances all over the world. So it was not something that was unique to India. But India invited attention for various reasons that I've told you, that the Europeans discovered new route to India, so they urge for writing travel logs on India. Then the missionaries creating confusion and distortion. So there are many reasons why the spotlight has been fixed on us, and we were the jewel in the British crown.
Absolutely. I think what you have done through your extensive research and through the publication of this book goes a long way in clarifying these misconceptions. I think the myths have been created over several or more than a century. So it's going to take its time to dispel these myths. But I think
independent India has continued parroting the British myths. Imagine in every textbook of independent India, the Bentinck is hailed as the person who abolished sati. What about the Indian rulers before him?
Yeah, I think it moves slowly. I think that consciousness is now coming among Indians.
Yes.
That let's re-examine our past. Let's think about in different lights than what we have been prescribed by the.
And Yajur, what I find interesting and very encouraging is the number of young people who reach out to me now. They're not historians or academics, but they want to know something that is more genuine about their past. So this is a very encouraging sign, that they say that we are fed up with what we have been taught. It's so much of it is false, and it produces a sense of self-worthlessness. That we were doing this to our people. It creates in the young people a sense that they're inheritors of an evil culture and civilization, which is so wrong, and they want to get rid of that.
I absolutely agree with you, ma'am. Very quickly, just before we conclude, I want to quickly bring in a question from somebody who's been waiting, Vikram Jha. He wants to ask you, where did the Hindu supporters of Sati Pratha gaining the legitimacy for it? So where do they, why are there Hindu supporters of Sati Pratha, and where do they get legitimacy for their arguments? What were the supportive arguments from their side? Did they gain it from any Hindu scripture? And last, what was the first instance of sati immolation noted in Indian history? I think you mentioned that already.
I've already mentioned that. And I have said that religious scriptures don't sanction it. And from the medieval period onwards, there's a debate. Some people do say that in the circumstances it is good. But Medha Tithi says it is black magic. Until the 18th century, there is debate. But at no point is there a universal recommendation by the Smriti writers or the Dharma writers that women should immolate. They always say it is better to lead a chaste life. And the first instance of sati, I've already mentioned, it is a historical fact that it was recorded by Diodorus. It concerned a sati in the army of Alexander. But thank you for asking this question.
And to his question about the people who resisted it, or at least who opposed the argument, obviously we know there wasn't any major resistance in India at all. But could it just be that it was seen as an interference by a foreign occupier, which was the main point of contention, as opposed to the practice itself?
Brilliant, brilliant. The person who led the campaign against British action on Sati was Radha Kant Dev. Radha Kant Dev was saying that we do not want British interference in our customs, because that will lead, one thing will lead to another, and it will lead to a disintegration of our society. But Radha Kant Dev did not encourage sati. And there was no instance of sati in his family. He was against the British edict on sati because he said, don't interfere in our internal matters. In fact, Radha Kant Dev was a great educator. He was involved in the running of Hindu College in Calcutta for almost 3 decades. And he said there is no conflict between indigenous education and Western learning. So it's not that he was a hidebound conservative, not willing to listen to Western ideas and all that. He was open to English education, and he was in charge of Hindu College for 3 decades. And no person in his family committed sati or advocated sati. They said, we don't want British interference in our social matters. That's what the point was.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jain. This was a brilliant talk, and it dispels many myths about sati and in Indian heritage. So I think it was very enlightening for me, ma'am, and hopefully for everyone in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yajur, for inviting me. It's an honor and privilege to be on your show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Namaskar.